The first time German reconnaissance pilots spotted the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress sitting on a fog-shrouded British airfield, they didn't flinch. They didn't worry. They didn't feel a tremor of fear. Instead, they smirked at its unusual proportions, broad wings, swollen fuselage, for lumbering engines that made it look like a cargo hauler pretending to be a bomber. It seemed too big, too slow, too American. A flying barn, one Luftwaffe pilot joked over mess hall coffee. Another quipped that it looked like it needed a tow truck more than it needed a runway. Among the confident, battle-hardened German aces of 1942, the B-17 was a curiosity, not a threat. They expected it to fall apart the moment real flak or fighter fire touched it. After all, they had torn apart Soviet DB-3s, shattered British Wellingtons, and shredded countless other Allied bombers with seasoned ease. This new American machine, they believed, would be no different. But beneath the laughter and mockery, something else simmered: curiosity. The Luftwaffe Intelligence Corps studied the B-17's armor layout, its self-sealing fuel tanks, its 8 to 11.50 caliber machine guns positioned like a hedgehog of steel. What kind of bomber carried guns everywhere? What kind of designers expected their aircraft to fight its way through enemy defenses instead of slipping past them? It was an unsettling thought, one that German engineers noted but did not yet respect. Meanwhile in Britain, the first American crews trained relentlessly. Ground crews learned the aircraft like an extension of their own bodies, climbing into gun turrets, memorizing repair procedures, running drills on fuel systems. Pilots practiced flying in tight formations, sometimes mere meters apart, learning discipline that would one day decide whether they lived or died. Waist gunners hefted heavy belts of .50 cal ammunition, loading them until their shoulders ached. The bomber's reputation as a fortress grew not from propaganda, but from the way the aircraft felt: rugged, resilient, defiant. When the B-17 first crossed the Channel on operational raids, the Luftwaffe came to greet it with confidence. German aces dove from above, cannons blazing, expecting an easy kill. What they found instead was shocking: plumes of smoke, flashes of fire, streams of .50 cal bullets screaming back at them like metal hail. The B-17 didn't dodge. It didn't break formation. It simply held its course, its gunners roaring in fury as their barrels overheated. And that was the moment the laughter began to fade. The flying barn wasn't running. It was fighting. That day, the Luftwaffe didn't yet fear the B-17. But they stopped mocking it. They had seen the first hint of the storm that was coming. German pilots were used to dominance. When they dove on most bombers, one burst of cannon fire was enough to rip apart a wing, ignite a fuel line, or send an engine spiraling into the void. But when they attacked the B-17 for the first time in earnest, things did not go as expected. Their bullets struck home, yes. They punched holes in aluminum skin, shattered windows, ripped fabric, and scarred engines. But the B-17 kept flying. It didn't break apart. It didn't plummet. It simply absorbed the punishment with a grim resilience that stunned even the most experienced aces. One Luftwaffe pilot, after putting 20mm shells directly into a B-17's tail, returned to base furious, demanding to know why the bomber refused to die. Ground crews shrugged. They could offer no explanation. The Americans inside the bombers felt every impact. The metal shuddered. The engines groaned. The airframe trembled like a living beast absorbing blows. But the men held steady. The pilot held the yoke. The navigator called heading corrections. The radio operator relayed status reports. And the gunners scanned the sky for the next attacker. When the Germans came in for their second pass, they came closer, too close. And suddenly, the fortress answered. Twin streams of burning tracers lanced toward the Messerschmitts. One German ace watched in horror as a lucky .50 cal round shattered his canopy, spraying glass across his flight suit. Another felt his wings shear away after a hail of bullets tore through his fuselage. The Luftwaffe had expected a victim. Instead, they had found an opponent. The battle ended with several B-17s limping home, engines coughing, metal torn and scorched. But incredibly, almost unbelievably, most made it back. They landed with landing gear half broken, wings shredded, fuel leaking, crews covered in blood and soot. German pilots realized something unsettling. If these bombers could survive this, then the war in the skies was about to grow far more complicated. The B-17 had earned its first whisper of respect, but the real fear was still to come. This was the day the Luftwaffe stopped treating B-17s as lumbering machines and started treating them as predators. The Americans had refined their formation tactics. The bombers flew in tight boxes, 3, 6, 12 at a time, interlocking their fields of fire until they created a floating fortress city in the sky. It was a sight that unnerved even hardened German veterans. When the Luftwaffe scrambled to intercept one such formation, the sky filled with engines, smoke, and the echoing rumble of dozens of .50 cal machine guns. German fighters approached with discipline, diving at what they believed was the best angle, frontal attack. It was their standard tactic, one that had worked countless times. But this time, the sky erupted. The B-17 nose turret roared. The chin turret thundered. The top turret spat fury. And the waist guns swept arcs of fire across the sky. German pilots suddenly found themselves flying through walls of bullets so thick they could hear rounds slamming into their wings like hail on a tin roof. One ace described it afterward as flying into a meat grinder. Another said he had never been so afraid in his life. Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs twisted and rolled, trying to avoid the storm of steel. Some broke away in panic. Others pressed on, firing desperately before veering off trailing smoke. And some didn't escape at all. They spiraled downward, burning, their engines coughing black smoke. Inside the bombers, the gunners fought with ferocity. Their faces were smeared with sweat and oil. Empty brass casings piled at their feet. Barrels overheated and jammed. Gloves smoldered from the heat. But they kept firing. They kept protecting the formation. They kept each other alive. When the Luftwaffe broke off, the Americans were stunned to find they had survived. Not unscathed, not by a long shot, but intact. They had stood against the best Germany had, and they had not broken. That day, the B-17 proved something fundamental. It was not just a bomber. It was a fortress that fought back. By late 1943, the Luftwaffe no longer saw a single B-17 as a threat. They saw the formation as the true monster. High above Europe, thousands of meters over frozen clouds, dozens of B-17s flew wingtip to wingtip in what became the deadliest formation in aviation history, the combat box. Each bomber's guns covered another's blind spot. Each aircraft became a shield for the bomber beside it. And when they flew together, they created a killing field so dense with overlapping fire that even the bravest German pilots hesitated. From the ground, German civilians looked up during raids and gasped. It looked like the sky had grown teeth. Luftwaffe pilots approaching from below saw the sun glinting off a city of silver wings. Dozens of bombers cast long shadows across the clouds, their engines humming like a giant mechanical choir. When German fighters attacked, the formation erupted. Every turret turned as if guided by a single mind. Every gun opened fire in unison. Every bomber became part of the larger beast. The air between the attackers and the defenders turned into a shimmering curtain of tracers. German fighters dove into that curtain and came out with smoking engines, shattered canopies, and missing wing panels. Some pilots simply refused orders to attack frontal formations. They called it suicide. The Luftwaffe had mocked the Americans for bringing such a heavy, over-engineered machine into the war. Now they understood. This machine was built not just to bomb targets. It was built to survive. It was built to kill. It was built to blot out the sky. And this was only the beginning. The first time a German ace tried a frontal attack on a B-17, he expected the same outcome he had seen 100 times before in combat: slash in fast, fire a quick burst, and break away before the enemy could react. That tactic had worked against Soviet P-2s, British Wellingtons, and helpless supply aircraft. But when he lined up the nose of his Bf-109 with the massive silver wall of the Flying Fortress, he suddenly realized something was wrong. He was staring into a forest of gun barrels. The B-17 didn't just have firepower. It had firepower pointed right at the path he needed to take. The Luftwaffe initially believed frontal attacks were the key to cracking the American heavy bomber. They analyzed its construction, its armor, and its famous tail guns. German intelligence knew the B-17's rear quarter was dangerous, and they taught their pilots to avoid it. What they did not anticipate was the Americans modifying their tactics on the fly, adding more forward firepower and training their gunners to unleash synchronized bursts. On one early mission, a formation of B-17s inbound to Bremen found themselves under attack from a group of veteran Luftwaffe pilots from JG-26. The Germans swooped in with confidence. But as they approached head-on, the nose guns, cheek guns, and top turret opened up at the same moment. Streams of .50 caliber tracers tore the sky into glowing lines. The German aces were shocked to see their wingmen ripped apart in the first pass, machines torn open, engines smoking, pilots bailing out. The surviving German pilots pulled away, shaken. No one had expected fire like that. One ace later wrote in his diary, "The sky became a wall of burning needles. One could not fly through it." As more missions followed, the truth became undeniable. Frontal attacks were suicide. B-17s firing in coordinated bursts had created a kill zone so deadly that even veteran Luftwaffe pilots felt their hands shake on the controls. The B-17's defensive layout, once mocked as excessive, turned out to be a masterpiece. Its overlapping fields of fire created a moving fortress in the sky. German fighters diving through those killing zones experienced the same sensation over and over, one moment racing in with confidence, the next moment watching their cockpit glass explode into shards. The Luftwaffe adapted. They tried high side attacks, low side attacks, slashing attacks from oblique angles. But every adjustment cost them aircraft and pilots. The B-17s flew on, battered but alive. Gun barrels glowed red. Waist gunners shouted for ammunition. Oxygen masks froze solid. And still, the fortress kept firing. For the first time since 1939, the Luftwaffe was encountering an enemy aircraft that could not be bullied. The German ace Hans-Jürgen Marseille once said that air combat was a chess match with bullets. But against the Flying Fortress, that chessboard suddenly felt rigged. No matter where the Germans approached, there was a gun waiting. More and more Luftwaffe pilots began to refuse the dangerous head-on runs. Some disobeyed orders. Others broke off early. A few simply said nothing, but flew wide arcs around the bomber streams, waiting for someone else to take the risk. Even the bravest aces, the ones with dozens of kills, admitted privately that the B-17 was unlike anything they had fought before. By late 1943, a chilling phrase began spreading across Luftwaffe airfields. The fortress chooses who dies today. And in that single sentence lay the truth. German mockery had vanished. In its place was fear. Schweinfurt was the mission no one wanted, but everyone knew had to be flown. Deep in the heart of Germany, the city's ball-bearing factories kept the Nazi war machine alive. If the Americans could cripple them, German armor, aircraft, and transport vehicles would grind to a halt. But the price of striking so far inland, without escort fighters, would be enormous. On the morning of the Schweinfurt Regensburg raids, the bomber crews felt it in their bones. The briefing room was silent. Maps covered the walls. Arrows pointed deep into Germany, deeper than the B-17s had ever gone. The room buzzed with tension, not fear, because fear was too small a word. It felt like standing at the edge of a cliff. When the formation lifted off, the sky was clear. Waves of Fortress engines shook the ground. The crews adjusted their oxygen masks and steel helmets. They knew the Luftwaffe would come. It did. Over Belgium, the first attacks began. Dozens of German fighters, Bf-109s, FW-190s, even twin-engine Astoras armed with cannon, fell upon the bomber stream like wolves. The B-17 gunners fired until their barrels glowed. Empty casings clanged on the floors. Oxygen systems hissed. Planes burst into flame. Parachutes blossomed behind crippled fortresses. But the formations kept flying. Then came the flak. Over Schweinfurt, the sky became a cauldron of black shrapnel clouds. The bombers plunged into the inferno. Crews heard shrapnel tearing through their aircraft like hail on tin roofs. One fortress lost half a wing and spiraled into the factories below. Another flew on fire, engine smoking, but released its bombs before breaking apart. When the survivors reached the target, they opened their bomb bay doors and let loose a rain of destruction. The ball-bearing plants burned. Machine tools shattered. Workshops exploded. But the return flight was worse. The Luftwaffe struck again. Fighters fired at point-blank range. B-17s limped across Germany with engines out, fuel leaking, wings shredded. Some fell into forests. Others ditched in fields. A few vanished into clouds, never to be seen again. Only half the force returned to England. Ground crews wept as crippled fortresses rolled onto the runway. Medics carried away the wounded. Chaplains stood beside stretchers, whispering last rites. And amid the smoke and blood, the commanders realized a truth that would change the war. The B-17 had survived. The mission had succeeded. But it had come at almost unbearable cost. Schweinfurt became a symbol of pain, of sacrifice, but also of the indomitable will of the Flying Fortress crews who refused to turn away from impossible missions. The Germans had shot down many bombers, but they had not broken the Americans. Not even close. The crews of the B-17 Flying Fortress had faced fighters, storms, mechanical failures, and bitter cold at 25,000 feet, but nothing struck terror into their hearts quite like the black, blooming flowers of German flak. Unlike the dancing, hungry fighters that slashed in and out of the formation, flak felt personal, mathematically precise, coldly timed, and fired from steel fortresses on the ground whose crews never saw the faces of the men they were trying to kill. Flak didn't chase. It waited. It listened. It calculated. It turned the sky into a trap. On the long approaches to deep strike targets, Essen, Hamm, Bremen, Schweinfurt, Regensburg, and the heart of Berlin, the B-17 crews knew the dreadful ritual. The sky would start empty and blue, peaceful even. Then the first puffs would appear, small, black smudges at the edges of their vision. Someone on the intercom would mutter, "Flak at 2 o'clock, range 5 miles." And then the black clouds multiplied. Every burst was not just explosive. It was shrapnel, forged steel claws spinning outward at supersonic speeds, hungry to shred aluminum skin and human flesh. The B-17s droned forward in their rigid formations because they had no choice. If they weaved, swerved, or scattered, the entire formation collapsed, and that collapse meant death. So they flew straight through it. Straight into the claws. Inside the buzzing aluminum tubes, the crews gripped their guns, their oxygen masks freezing against their faces, frost forming on their eyebrows. The pilots held the yoke steady even as explosions buffeted their wings like invisible sledgehammers. Navigator tables rattled violently. Bombardiers tried to keep their gaze fixed on the Norden bombsight while flak bursts strobed the cockpit like lightning. At 20,000 feet, each explosion felt like a giant fist slamming the air. At 25,000, it felt like the sky itself was breaking apart. The Germans knew exactly what they were doing. Their flak towers were masterpieces of military engineering, reinforced concrete citadels bristling with 88 mm, 105 mm, and 128 mm guns. From Hamburg to Berlin to Vienna, these towers were monstrous guardians of the Reich, immune to anything short of a direct, point-blank bombardment. And they hated the B-17. Flak commanders learned to time their shots so bursts appeared at the precise altitude and exact airspeed of the incoming bomber stream. They adjusted windage. They spoke in calm voices. They fired as if they were conducting an orchestra of destruction. For the B-17 crews, the worst part was the sound. A sharp, metallic ping as a fragment hit the fuselage. A heavy thud when a piece punched through the skin. A sudden whoosh of escaping oxygen when a line ruptured. Or the horrifying screech of shrapnel tearing through the wing. Every noise could be the start of a fire, or an engine failure, or the end. Inside, gunners tried to stay calm. Waist gunners leaned into their .50 cals, not firing but scanning, waiting for fighters to emerge through the black haze. The ball turret gunner, suspended beneath the bomber like a fragile bead of glass, could see flak bursts rising from below like growing, blooming metal roses. The top turret gunner shouted directions as shells burst dangerously close to the cockpit. Pilots fought to hold formation. Bombardiers whispered prayers. Radio operators tightened their harnesses and braced. Sometimes a B-17 simply vanished, one moment in formation, the next swallowed by a direct hit, vaporized into a pillar of flame and shredded aluminum. Those were the explosions that turned stomachs cold. Those were the hits that made even the bravest gunners close their eyes. And yet, the formations kept moving. Because behind them were thousands of factories. Thousands of workers. Millions depending on them. The B-17 was a fortress, yes, but it was also a promise. During raids over the Ruhr, the infamous Flak Alley, crews endured continuous barrages for 20 minutes at a time. 20 minutes of hell at 20,000 feet. 20 minutes of explosions, rattling metal, burning smells, freezing air, and the constant fear that the next burst would be the last sound they ever heard. Bombardiers grit their teeth through the shaking. They needed a steady pass, no evasion, if the bombs were to hit their target. With flak bursting so close the plane felt like it was vibrating apart, they still focused, still adjusted the small metal knobs on the Norden sight. When the bombs finally dropped, the entire aircraft lurched upward with sudden lightness. The pilot called, "Bombs away." The formation turned for home, straight back through more flak, back through the gauntlet, back through the fire. Some limped home on 2 engines. Some on 1. Some left trails of smoke that stretched across the sky. Some didn't make it. But every crew that survived carried the marks of those black bursts, holes in wings, shattered plexiglass, fragments embedded in bulkheads, and the memory of a sky full of blooming death. And the Luftwaffe watched them return, mission after mission, and understood something they had not believed at first. The Flying Fortress was not just durable. It was unstoppable. The winter of 1943 had been a nightmare the bomber crews could barely describe without their voices tightening. They had flown into the heart of Germany knowing the Luftwaffe waited for them like wolves circling a wounded stag. Every deep strike had meant brutal attrition. Waves of Bf-109s and FW-190s carving through bomber boxes before the fortresses could even close on target. Crews whispered the name Schweinfurt like a curse, remembered limping home through skies filled with fire, counting empty seats where friends had been. And then everything changed. It began with a low, rising hum on the horizon, one that B-17 tail gunners first mistook for German interceptors before recognizing the elegant silhouette slicing through the clouds. The P-51 Mustang had arrived. The Luftwaffe aces who once dove confidently at unescorted bomber streams suddenly found a new predator waiting above them. The Mustang did not merely escort, it hunted. It surged ahead of the bomber formations like a vanguard of steel, diving into German attack groups before they even reached firing range. Luftwaffe pilots, seasoned and proud, suddenly found themselves chased instead of chasing, forced to break off attack runs mid-scream as a Mustang's .50 cals tore past their canopies. The bomber crews, who had long watched German interceptors circle them with dreadful anticipation, now saw a different sight. Enemy fighters peeling away in panic before the P-51s even opened fire. A Fortress waist gunner, watching Mustangs weave among contrails with terrifying grace, muttered into his intercom, "Boys, the cavalry's here." And in that moment, the Luftwaffe knew the sky was no longer theirs. By early 1944, the Luftwaffe was fighting a war it could no longer afford. Their greatest aces were dead or exhausted, their fuel scarce, their airfields pockmarked by craters. Every time they scrambled to intercept a bomber stream, the sky above them filled with Mustangs, thunderbolts, and lightning sweeping in from every direction. What had once been a disciplined defense became chaotic desperation. German pilots raced to climb into attack position only to be ambushed halfway up. Others reached the bomber formations only to be shredded by defensive crossfire the moment they committed to an attack run. And as bomber streams grew larger, hundreds of B-17s stretching from horizon to horizon, the Luftwaffe's tactical options shrank to nothing. Airfields that once hummed with confidence now echoed with frantic shouts, ground crews begging for spare parts, and commanders urging pilots into the air knowing many wouldn't return. Some interceptors took off with half-serviced engines, others with untested weapons. Young, barely trained replacements were shoved into cockpits they had practiced in for just weeks. Meanwhile, American raids intensified in both frequency and scale. The B-17s came in such numbers that German civilians began describing the sky itself as metallic. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, was bleeding out in real time. By the spring raids on Berlin and Leipzig, many German pilots no longer asked whether they would shoot down a bomber, they asked whether they would survive the climb. Inside every fortress was a crew of 10 men who learned to trust one another with their lives. Over time, some of these gunners became legends, names spoken with or in briefing tents and written on the fuselage in small, neat tally marks. They were men who mastered the strange, freezing ballet of aerial gunnery, tracking a diving 109 while the bomber shook under flak bursts, firing at a fighter while praying that the tail gunner also saw the second one hiding below, calling out enemy movements with a calmness that defied the chaos around them. These aces did not fight from a sleek cockpit. They fought from a windowed world of aluminum, oil, smoke trails, and endless cold. And they became so feared that Luftwaffe pilots sometimes aborted attack runs when they recognized certain nose art or tail numbers. One waist gunner with the 303rd Bomb Group was credited with downing fighters in 5 consecutive missions. A top turret gunner in the 91st shot down 3 Bf-109s in a single defensive burst, earning him the nickname Sky Reaper. A tail gunner of the 94th became famous across the 8th Air Force for hitting an FW-190 at over 900 yards, an almost impossible shot. These men were not famous back home. They had no glamorous posters or medals paraded on newsreels. They sat on metal floors, breathed oxygen from cracking masks, and fought in a freezing, deafening world where every mission could be their last. Yet their accuracy, discipline, and raw courage saved entire formations. They were the reason dozens of fortresses made it back to England instead of being remembered only as smoke drifting across the North Sea. When the order came, massive strike on Berlin, the air crews understood immediately what it meant. Berlin was not just a city. It was the beating heart of Nazi power. It was ringed with flak towers that spat shells like volcanic eruptions. It was protected by the last veteran squadrons of the Luftwaffe, pilots who had survived years of combat and now prepared for a fight they knew might be their last. And into that gauntlet flew the B-17s, hundreds upon hundreds of them, engines rumbling in perfect synchrony as they climbed through the cold March sky. Below them, The Reich shuddered as sirens wailed across its capital. Above them, the Mustangs swept ahead in vast arcs, driving off interceptors before they could even form up. And within the bomber formations, men tightened their flak jackets, kissed Lucky Charms taped to instrument panels, and stared down at the city they had been warned would be hell itself. The flak was beyond anything most had ever seen, black blossoms exploding with such density that some gunners swore they could have stepped from one cloud to the next. Shells tore through wings, wounded men, and ignited fires inside bomb bays. Yet the formations held. They opened their bomb bay doors and dropped their payloads through curtains of smoke and fire, watching explosions ripple across industrial districts, rail hubs, and military centers. Some fortresses limped home on one engine, glass blown out, oxygen masks dangling, counting miles like prayers. Others didn't make it, falling in slow, burning arcs, their crews bailing out into a sky lit red by the flames of Berlin. But the mission succeeded. And Germany learned that even its proudest, most fortified city could be reached, and burned, by the Flying Fortress. When the war finally ended and the Fortress crews came home, the world viewed the B-17 not just as a bomber but as a symbol of resilience, endurance, and the staggering cost of breaking a regime determined to dominate Europe. The aircraft itself became legend, its ability to absorb damage that would have shredded any other bomber, its crews whose teamwork turned aluminum shells into floating fortresses, its presence in the sky so overwhelming that German civilians describe it as clouds made of steel. Museums began restoring B-17s, and veterans walked the hangars years later with tears in their eyes, touching cold metal that once vibrated with life beneath their boots. And everywhere the story was told, one truth remained constant. The Luftwaffe never fully recovered from the day the fortresses arrived in mass formation. For the men who served inside them, the B-17 was more than a machine. It was a home, a shield, and sometimes a coffin. They remembered the rattling of .50 cals, the ice creeping along window frames, the voices of friends crackling over intercoms, the sudden silence when a gunner's line went dead. Yet they also remembered triumph, missions that turned the tide of air supremacy, raids that crippled war industries, and the moment when the Luftwaffe finally broke under the combined weight of fortresses and Mustangs. And in that legacy lies the aircraft's lasting power. The B-17 did not win the war alone. But without it, the war could not have been won.